Welcome to another interview segment here on The Breakdown. We're very fortunate today to be out on the Stoney Nakoda Reserve, and we're sitting down with Rachel Snow. Rachel has a pretty significant background in First Nations and Indigenous law, as well as a well-established history as an advocate for First Nations issues. So, Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us
Oh, you're
today.
very welcome.
Was I okay with everything that I said there?
Welcome to the reserve,
Thank you.
and thanks for getting here on time.
Eventually. we made it eventually. So the biggest reason why I wanted to sit down with you today is there's obviously a whole lot of conversation that's happening around what's going on in Wet'suwet'en. And it seems like there's a lot of context that's missing from that conversation, and it seems like there's a lot of background information. And what we're hoping to try to do today is flesh out a little bit more context, so it's people realize that it's not necessarily quite as binary or simple an issue as it's being presented through a lot of the media. So to start with, I think my first question would be, what can you tell me about the land mechanism that's going on here? So the idea of treaty land versus ceded and unceded territories.
Okay, so first of all, when we start any kind of conversation, when we're talking about the Indigenous First Nation, the Native American perspective of the land, we're talking about our relationship with the land as being a connection to the land. So that connectivity, that understanding that every First Nation tribe or group has, that's the first point we start at, even though it seems that mainstream is not able to grasp that concept unless we look at the land as within a property context. So then when you take the land and look within a property context, then you're looking at things that like Aboriginal title. So 1763, the Royal Proclamation, King George comes over and says all land can be alienated, or it will be only alienated to the crown. So that kind of sets up the nation-to-nation relationship that we're talking about title of the land and being the first occupiers of the land, being in that relationship to share the land with the British Crown. So that is our first understanding of Aboriginal title, or what the courts are saying Aboriginal title is. So you have Aboriginal title land. That's the lands, the resources, and everything that flows with the land that First Nations have had since time immemorial, from as a gift from the Creator. That's what Aboriginal title apparently means. But then you also have treaty land. So there are different treaties spanning across Canada, and the reason why mainstream Canada always gets different interpretations is because not all treaties are the same. From the Eastern tribes, the peace and friendship treaties, coming out west to finally like the Douglas treaties in BC, and some of the Treaty 8 historic number treaty that overlaps into the BC area. There are a number of treaties and a number of points within those treaties or agreements that make that treaty land. Then you have something you mentioned, Aboriginal title, treaty land, unceded territory. Where a nation has not made an agreement with the federal crown or with the British crown, that is primarily the BC, a number of the nations now in the BC area, that land is unceded. So they occupy the land. They haven't made any kind of an agreement with the British crown or the federal government or the provincial government. So they're saying that that land, that territory, still belongs to them. Where this started to get kind of some weight for the BC First Nations was in 1973 in the Calder Case. The Calder Case was the first case that kind of established that there was something called Aboriginal title, that there was some kind of a right for the people, for the Indigenous people, to the land. From the 1973 Calder Case, there's never another case about land, because the Canadian court system is much happier arguing about fishing rights or hunting rights or something that doesn't affect the land and the resources, because Canada really is here at the or with the as partners with the First Nations. They're here with our blessings, and by we have allowed them to share Canada with us. So that never comes across as part of the treaties or any of the discussions that have happened since the settlers and since colonization happened in Canada. But after the Calder case, the next big case that happened was Delgamuukw. Delgamuukw in 1997, and this case took 10 years to get into the courts. I think it started 10 or 12 years, but it took a long time. And this is the Wet'suwet'en and the Gitxaala people where the controversy is right now. They were the two First Nations who went to the Supreme Court and said, we have 22,000 acres or 22,000 miles or whatever it is in their territory, and it's unceded. They have never had any kind of agreement with the British Crown, with the Canadian government, or with the British Columbia province. So that's what they're standing on today. That's the actual fact of the matter, is that nobody has come forward to them and made some kind of a treaty agreement. Now, after you talk about the history of what has been happening in the BC territory, and specific to the Wet'suwet'en, then you also have to look at, the next thing that you're going to have to look at is the modern day treaties, some of the agreements that have been happening. And again, it's so difficult for mainstream Canada, because in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, there's historic treaties that were signed with the First Nations. So that's their understanding of a treaty. There are modern day treaties going on that we call termination tables, where land is being ceded and surrendered to Canada and British Columbia. The Wet'suwet'en, this particular one band of the six bands that are there, has not been at that table or ceded anything. So that's why they still feel that they are the rightful land owners or holders, and that this is their inherent responsibility to protect the land.
Would it be fair to oversimplify grossly, obviously, to say that for the Wet'suwet'en, the land that we're talking about, for all intents and purposes, from their perspective, is a country that has never surrendered to the entity that is Canada, that has never agreed to join the entity that is Canada? Is that a rough oversimplification?
I think, again, because the First Nations people, one of the things we're taught as First Nation people is kindness and respect, and to share. So I can't say that, and I can't speak for the Wet'suwet'en First Nations, but that is always my understanding, is that, and that goes back to what I first started with about the land, understanding what the meaning of the land is. The land is a part of us, a connection of who we are, or a continuation of who we are and who our people have always been. We really don't own the land, but we're part of the land. Now, when we try to talk and when we speak to mainstream, and they're hearing this sort of ambiguous or ambiguity, no certainty in that answer because it's more philosophical or spiritual, then we have to go into this legal language and start to say, okay, well, there's such a thing as title. There's such a thing as property rights. There's such a thing as there is a quid pro quo. We're going to share the land, and in return, we have some things, education, housing, whatever we have, because we're sharing the land and resources. So I can't say that the Wet'suwet'en would say that they would never want to share.
Oh, yeah.
I think that they would, certainly all of our peoples, when settlers came into this country, were very hospitable and welcoming. So I can't see, I don't know how welcoming they're going to be with the RCMP on their doorstep now.
Yeah.
I think that's a valid concern, but I think that historically, that's why they went through the Supreme Court. They went through the machinations or the institutions that are available for. They went through that. So when they did that, they actually were trying to seek some kind of reconciliation or resolution to the issue.
Would it be safe to say that the Wet'suwet'en as a nation haven't gotten to a place with Canada where they believe or they feel comfortable sharing the responsibility to take care of the land with Canada proper.
I think that's more or less more along the lines of probably what is the truth for the Wet'suwet'en and for many First Nations, because we have this inherent belief of kindness and sharing and respect. So we are going to share and be kind and mindful, but we also expect that what we believe, our belief system, if we are able to adjust and take on some of the good in mainstream society, we think that it makes sense that there is good in our society. And that's where we're talking about things like protecting the land, protecting the water. And that's actually evolved now into climate change, which is maintaining that balance, which is what we were put here to do. And I think what Wet'suwet'en people are really standing on that right now, because they understand that where they are located, this area, and for for not being able to have their voice heard any other way, it's ridiculous that in a country that claims to have excellent treatment of Indigenous people, in a province that just legislated the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it's ridiculous that we're seeing RCMP and sort of a media blackout happening right now in Canada.
Mm-hmm. One of the conversations that's been very much taking place in the mainstream has been it seems like questioning the validity of the different structures for authority, and I'm speaking in very broad terms within that nation. So a large part of the confusion seems to stem between the idea between the democratically elected chiefs of those areas and the hereditary chiefs. So can you kind of walk through what the difference is between that two and how that difference came to be?
Well, I think, and again, generally speaking, prior to colonization, prior to the settlers coming, the Indigenous people, their way of life, their livelihood, everything was provided for within their communities. They had a governance system, they had a healthcare system, they had an education system. Whatever was necessary for their community to thrive and exist, the Indigenous people had it. Now, with colonization, one of the first things we see happening is the creation of the Indian Act. With the creation of the Indian Act comes Indian agents and the Indian people being put onto reserves. We're given passes. We're told that we can't leave the reserves without a pass. So this looks very much like apartheid, but it also, at the same time, is beginning to restrict the First Nations access in and out of the spaces that they usually used and walked in. So there's some things starting to change for the First Nations people. The other thing is that the Indian agent is responsible for they're responsible for the rations and for any of the agreements, the agriculture implements, anything, the seed, the guns, the ammunition, anything that was signed at treaty. The Indian agent on reserve is responsible for that. So the Indian agent starts to either hold the rations or they're giving the Indians rancid meat. Meanwhile, a charter was given to the Hudson's Bay Company, and there's a lot of hunters going through the plains, killing the buffalo, killing some of the foods and what the Indian people relied on to eat. So the Indians are growing more reliant on those rations. And if you're reliant on the rations and the person who's holding those rations is being tyrannical, we're starting to see that that fear and those starvation tactics happening in our communities. There were some First Nations who were not taking this. And I don't know how to pronounce this man's name, but he was from Haudenosaunee. But he went to the League of Nations, Descada, I don't know how to pronounce his name. He went to the League of Nations and he protested and saying, we are nations, you cannot treat us like this if you come into our area. By the time he got back into Ontario, Lower Ontario, where the Haudenosaunee Mohawk people are, they had stripped him of his hereditary chieftainship title, and they had run an election in their community, and they had elected chief and council. To this day, that community is having troubles between the Longhouse, or between the hereditary chiefs, and between the elected chief and council. So that starts the background. You're starting to see that there's a problem between what was always done for our communities and what is being called a democratic or a democratically elected council. Again, mainstream thinks that a democratic elected council is a very good thing because you live in Calgary, you live in Canmore, you live in Banff, you live in Ottawa, you live wherever. You move into that area, you don't have any family, you don't have any spiritual places, language, you haven't named the creeks or anything, but you're living in Canada and you have a say on, whether so much of your money goes into healthcare or education, what you supplement. So you listen very carefully to the people who are running for seats in the provincial legislature or the national office, and then you vote based on that person's platform. So then you're electing the best possible person you can for that job, and everybody, one man, one vote. Okay, so bring that idea to the reserve, where the demographics never changes. We really don't have people moving in and out. So what has happened over time is that if you have a very large family, they can essentially control the vote. So if they control the vote, and say you have only 200 band members in your community, and 55 people are voting, and 50 are from one family, that family is always going to be the chief and council. And the 5 who are left out are left out. And this is actually happening in some bands in British Columbia too. So then you start to see, does that democratically elected model have the same weight on a reserve as it does in mainstream? Now, but then again, we have to go back to our original governance models. And I was talking about this man from the Mohawk community. That traditional governance, or that hereditary governance, is handed down. It's a responsibility, and with it comes the spiritual teachings and the selflessness and all those things that make us who we are. When you have that faction in your community of knowing who they are, and you have the other faction, the assimilated or the colonized people in your community, that's where we're starting to see this. We're starting to see this clash. We're starting to see people who are the democratically elected councils fighting with hereditary chiefs and councils. The hereditary chiefs and councils are doing what they were supposed to do. They're holding the land. They're respecting the spirits, the ancestors, everything that comes with that land. That's what they're doing. These democratically elected people are products of a governance system that was set up by Indian Affairs. So in effect, the Indian agents that were there, these are the new Indian agents in the reserve. They're from your own community, but they may not have the same hereditary or the same governance capacities, abilities that we had. Because if you think 100 years ago, 150 years ago, in the even in the Haudenosaunee tribe or nation, the Mohawk nation, the matriarchs helped pick the leader. And that's true, not necessarily was it just the matriarchs, but certainly the elders and the community had a say. They would watch a child, they would watch to see if they were kind, if they expressed themselves well, if they played well with others, if they thought of people. They look for those leadership qualities, because that person is going to selflessly serve the people, because we function as a collective. We don't function as the one. We function as the many. So that's another thing that has to be understood, is that in the system of governance, where in mainstream you have a top-down governance system and you have somebody at the top sort of directing what happens, it's the complete opposite in the Indigenous system, where it's the people who give the answers up to, it's the person who's actually in the traditional governance position is a servant to the people. So you have these different ideas conflicting about Indian Act chief and councils versus hereditary chief and councils if you don't understand what one is and what the other is, or why there are differences, or why it's necessary to understand that there's one true voice and one compromised voice, then you don't understand what the issue is, because everybody is looking at this saying, well, 5 out of 6 chiefs, 20 people have signed. That's the Indian Affairs councils that have signed or agreed to this. That may not necessarily be the people. And again, it's the people who are the decision makers, not necessarily just one chief or one council.
Do you think that it would be safe to say that in a lot of ways the idea of a democratically elected governance model doesn't align particularly well with some traditional First Nations aspects of culture?
Well, it again, and that depends, because I know a handful of Indian Act chief and councils where the chiefs and the councils are very much aware of their ancestral obligations and responsibilities. And even though they're functioning sort of in a modern world, they're actually taking the time and thinking through how they can kind of bring their values into contemporary or modern times. So they're trying to adjust, which is again why you'll hear some bands are doing this and are very, very much embracing, the economic development, and very much being a part of Canadian society, and they have a citizenship code, and they've municipalized their reserve and their holdings, and that may be okay for that First Nation if that First Nation feels that's the route that they want to go as a people. But there's also the other side, which is the First Nations, that we are holding on to who we are. How can I say I am Iahe Nakoda or part of my people if I am acting as a capitalist and hurting the land and the environment the same as everybody? I'm just a Canadian citizen then, right? I'm not, and I can't use the arguments of saying, well, I respect the land and I care for the land. And it's all if I'm actually out there signing, buying pipeline shares and trying to destroy the land and not thinking of future generations and the climate and everything that is happening currently in the world. If I am not Indigenous, and if I have forgotten my spiritual and my responsibilities that have been handed down from generation to generation, then I'm not Indigenous anymore. I really don't have that claim to speak for the Indigenous. So I think even there's a weight of the hereditary people or the true voices having more power and more say, because those are our actual voices. But those are the voices too that nobody wants to hear.
With that in mind, one of the statements that we hear a lot from people who are arguing for aggressive development of natural resources is that First Nations, as a blanket term, are supporting these developments. Given what you just said about the diversity of views and diversity of opinions, and the stewardship that is clearly very important to you, how would you like people to understand that saying First Nations is to me it's incredibly generic and misleading? What's your reaction to when people say, oh, First Nations like this thing?
Well, I think it's the same. It's the same as the term Indians was back in its heyday. It's and there's always those pan-Indian approaches. But I really don't think until I don't know more and social media started getting involved that Canada actually understood the distinction. That they understood that there are different linguistic speaking tribes, and that there are different nations with different ideologies or different they have specificity in who they are as Indigenous people. And I think they just generally applied and said the Indians or the First Nations. I think they generally applied that. But now they're starting to more or less hone in on, you hear this now, that these are the Gitskan and the Wet'suwet'en people. Mm-hmm. It's not, they're not saying it's Haida or whoever else. I'm sorry, I'm not really up on all the coastal names, and I probably would mispronounce them.
I'm sure you do a better
Worse than
job
you.
I don't know if you could possibly do it worse than me.
But I think that that's understanding the nationhood that goes to the nationhood, and that's what we've been saying, that media coverage lacks that, because they plop us all into one bucket of Indians. We're all the Indians in the bucket, and these Indians like development. So, oh, good, today all the Indians like development. That might be one tribe that has some mining or some specific venture happening in northern Ontario that they're doing in exchange for an ice road, or it could be, we don't know what the particulars are, but it's crazy to dump us all into one pot. But I'm saying, really, if for argument's sake, all the Indians should be in the pot I'm talking about. We should all be in that pot where, because we're Indigenous or Nahia or Nakota or Mohawk or Anishinaabe, whoever we are, we should be respecting the values that come, the teachings that come through the language, through the ceremonies, through the songs that make us who we are. That's what we should be doing. If we are truly Indigenous, that's who we are. It has really nothing to do with this over here.
How do you see that moving forward? How do you get there?
How do we get to?
How do you get back to where you were before?
Go backward?
Yeah, exactly.
I think you're starting to see, like, I think one of the things that I said when Idle No More was happening, I said that I believed that, yes, it was very nice to challenge Harper and the federal government, but when it comes down to it, and when we do get a seat at the table, our own leadership is going to be speaking for us. We've seen in the past 4 years with Trudeau's very close relationship with Pipeline Perry Bellegarde, so they're very much on the same page, and they've done some incredibly stupid things, like they've rammed through Bill C-92 in June of 2019 without funding. That's the child welfare bill, without funding and without really determining how that transition would look. For one thing, the First Nations, we didn't have such a thing as child welfare. There was always someone in your family who would take a child or adopt a child that was orphaned. That was just understood. That's part of our kinship and our collectivity to survive. So that's one. Now, breaking up the children with residential schools and then following it with the 60 scoop and the child family services system, all these things are tearing away at the kinship or the clan or the fabric of our collectivity. And so we have to get back to that collectivity, because right now mainstream teaches you you're in it for yourself. You're an individual. You have individual rights. I hear people now saying, my treaty right to education. Actually, it's our treaty right to education. It's the Nakoda treaty right to education, because our ancestors agreed to do this on behalf of the people, because they were thinking of us, all of us. And then we also agreed to go into the treaty, or agreed to share this land, because we knew that changes were coming, and for us to have a say and to help our relations, which includes the plants and the animals, the waters, the flying beings, everything. When we wanted to make sure that we had that say, we have to, if we want to have that say, then we have to know our customs, our values, our traditions. And right now, it's becoming difficult, because we learn that the person with the most toys wins. You need a new vehicle. Watch the commercials. I mean, you're not happy unless you have this, this, and this. It's not even, it's always been about progress and moving ahead and getting more. And we've always been cautious and said sustainable, live within the means, do not take more than you need. That is our understanding, is you don't need all that. If you don't need all that, leave some, leave berries for the bears, leave extra for somebody or for another time. That's just being respectful and kind, and not greedy. But greed is taken over. Greed is we need this pipeline. Never mind that there's a serious virus, and maybe they're not in any shape right now to pick up the gas that's trying to go through the pipeline or to use it. And I really haven't heard, I'm not hearing, I hear Canada's point saying, we need to get this over there. But I'm not hearing these so-called, the consumers from across the water saying, we're upset with you Indians as well. We're upset with you First Nations. We would really like to get this going so that business as usual. We're not hearing that.
One of the other criticisms that I've heard that I'd like to get your perspective on is there's a lot of pro-development media, let's say, who are trying to invalidate some of the protesters at not just the Wet Sweatin site, but at other protests across the country, and that are trying to apparently show support for what's going on there. And the way that they're doing is that they're saying that a lot of these protesters aren't a member of that particular nation, or they aren't a member of that particular area, or they've traveled from Vancouver or what have you. I'm curious what your sort of response is. Do you think that the support from non-nation members is helpful or a hindrance, or what's your take on that?
I'm surprised that they didn't just lump us all together and think we were all from the same reserve. That's one. They seem to have managed to distinguish us now. Say these are some northern Indians, these are some coastal Indians, these are from obviously downtown Vancouver.
Okay.
But with that, I said before, when we talk about the land, we all have that teaching, that responsibility. So whether it's the Wet'suwet'en or whether it was the Suet Standing Rock last year or a couple of years ago, we're all talking about the earth. We're all talking about our obligations. We're all talking about our responsibilities. So I think it's just now that, again, it's with social media that our people are actually able to record and actually able to put forth our point of view. Because prior to this, it was all pro-development media always. And you could, even if you did give an interview, or even if you did give the talk, you could be cut out or just a snippet of what you said to make it look like, well, these Indians over here agree, and then, just one piece of what you're saying. It was always put that way because I think at the end of the day, there is some kind of trauma happening for the non-First Nation people in accepting that the country or the land that they're working with is actually, stolen land, has not been properly reconciled with the First Nations. And so instead of saying we've done a huge disservice, I think it's easier to lash and it's easier to discredit, because that's, again, things you learn in mainstream. The player, plays the dirtiest, does whatever, wins. It's about winning. But actually, in this kind of a win, getting the development and ruining the land and the waters, it's actually a loss for everybody. And that's the climate, the community, the global community, the waters, and our future generations, the plants and the animals. So I don't know how important winning is when you're corporations and not really the people. I think the people on the ground Canadians deserve to know what exactly is happening. And we hear this again, even if the Wet'suwet'en could establish that this was their territory, the Supreme Court has laid out tests for Aboriginal title. They have laid out tests when they can actually infringe on an area, and that is for the greater good or for hydroelectric. So it's always some corporate venture or some corporate best interest that can trump the Indigenous. So I don't know why right now that they're they should try to resolve this in good faith with the Wet'suwet'en. And I think the Wet'suwet'en actually gave them an alternate path and said, look, this is an alternate area. We don't have any sacred areas here. It's not going to harm the water, for whatever reasons, because these people have lived there for thousands of years, for generations. They have an understanding of that climate and that environment. Can we take them and can we take their word and can we establish that as having some credibility and not just say, because, 3 justices at the BC court who probably have stocks or whatever they have vested interest in upholding the institution as it is, or mainstreams systemic racist institutions as they are. Can we just actually look at this one small nation, these elders standing there trying to protect something that is, it is almost like it's almost like the final stone that's gonna just let that volcano go. And can we just stop and take a moment to appreciate what the indigenous people have been saying all along? You have to live in harmony. You have to balance these things. Getting this pipeline to the coast to maybe not even a market doesn't seem to weigh as much as children in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years, 100 years, what they will be needing. And that again comes from, I don't need all the tools, I don't need all the toys, I don't need to win. I need to do what I need to do as best as I can for myself, but I also need to be thoughtful, mindful, care about that future, and care about the people who are coming after me. Because if I don't, well, let's just run pipelines through everything. I mean, why stop at the Indian reserves? Let's take them through downtown Calgary and everywhere else.
We're not allowed to take them through Quebec, though.
Oh, yeah. Well, you're not allowed to take them through Quebec, but that's what I mean. Like, if it's that important, too, why is it only the indigenous territories that are being rented? Because, again, we're expendable. The past system. We're subhuman. We're not seen as... we're not seen as the true landowners in this country. But that's who we are, and that's why these people are standing. So it doesn't matter if it's an Indian from Winnipeg, a First Nation, an Inuit, a Native American from down south. We are from this land, and we're going to protect it.
One of the other questions that I wanted to ask earlier that I was just so enthralled by all the things you're saying that I totally forgot about. I was in reading up about the Indian Act recently. One of the things that really struck me was a quote from John A. Macdonald. I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't have it in front of me. But basically what he said when that legislation came around was that its primary function was to eradicate First Nations culture. Do you think that the Indian Act can be revised to the point where it becomes a functional tool in the process of reconciliation, or has that fruit of the poison trees gotten to the point now where we need to start from scratch?
Well, something that is really interesting, I attend a lot of meetings, and I learned from Sharon Venn, who's a phenomenal lawyer and historian. She was talking about when the British Crown gave Canada to Canada, or the BNA Act to Canada, John A. Macdonald had to take on the role of Minister of Indian Affairs, or he had to take on that post because it was an international post because of Britain. So he actually formed, the way he could form a government or have some more authority, he could call himself the Prime Minister, yeah, whatever. But first of all, he was the Minister of Indian Affairs, which was an international post. So that's where he had some authority. So imagine that his authority comes from being the Minister of Indian Affairs. So he writes this act because, yes, he's going to eradicate, he's going to terminate, he's going to assimilate every First Nation person, because he is beholden to the Indian nations for this country, and he knows this. So that's where we see the Indian Act start with the racist policies. And there's so much more in the Indian Act aside from the passes. There was also one of the arguments I always like to hear from is from the Western Canadian saying, my grandpa came here in 1930, farmed his land, and did so, and that's why we're ahead. If the lazy Indian stereotype, had done the same thing, you'd be where we are today. I don't know what it is, making pierogies, whatever they're doing. But what happened with the First Nation people in the Indian Act is that they had actually, the Indian agent would not allow the First Nations who were using agriculture implements and who were planting and harvesting, the Indians were so good at this because they worked very hard and they understood what they were doing. They had obviously a relationship with the land. And not only one family, it wasn't, peasant farming or just Joe, Bob, and his son who were farming the land. All the relatives would come and harvest in one area, then move to the next. But then what the Indian agent did is he held the grain at the reserve until all the non-First Nation farmers around the area sold their grain, drove the prices down, then the Indians could take out their carts of wagons. So I always have a problem with that. We built ourselves from nothing. You could have done the same, when people aren't aware of the racist legislation that was in there, that was in there to cripple the First Nations, and for all intents and purposes continues to this day. Everything, the underfunding, Cindy Blackstock's fight. Off-reserve foster care was getting double what on-reserve foster care was getting. So we're actually being encouraged to send your children off-reserve, because on-reserve you could only get so much, and we're already living at poverty levels or subsistence levels. So you can see there's just that was John A. MacDonald saying that, 160 years ago, how much has really changed. Mm-hmm. And people are not understanding that either, saying, get over it. We're still in it. We could get over it if we'd stop being in it.
Yeah.
If we come up enough to have some air and have a breather, we might be able to say, okay, yes, we're actually, getting fair funding, equitable funding. We're actually being taken at our word. Our concerns are actually being validated properly, not by a token First Nation person or somebody who says yes or gets orders of Canada and all the other junk. It's actually somebody who is an Indigenous person, a traditional person, a hereditary leader, a young person, whoever it is, who's actually holding on to the values we've been given with pride and with honor, and saying these are mine and this is who I am, and I don't need to have that validation. But you actually could learn from this validation, because caring for the land, caring for one another, it's not such a bad thing.
When we spoke on the phone the first time, you used a metaphor that I really enjoyed. And you talked about how the initial relationship was supposed to be two canoes. First Nations in one canoe, Canada in the other canoe, but going together in the same direction. Do you think that's still possible?
Well, the waterways, no. with Nestle in Ontario, I don't think so. That actually comes from, I think that comes from the eastern, the Robinson Huron, the Treaty of Niagara, the Algonquin, Haudenosaunee Mohawk people out east is where that canoe comes from, where that reference comes from. But I like that reference too, that we'd have two canoes and we'd forever be going forward together in the same river, but we wouldn't be interfering with one another. And that is how the relationship was supposed to be. That's what we talk about. We talk about the treaty relationship. We talk about the ongoing relationship that was never to end. We gave up the land, we gave up the waters, the resources, but what was to be given back is education. And what we're seeing, it was. The residential schools were given back. Our kids were brutalized. We were to be given, housing. And you can see on reserve, there's more black mold, so many drinking water advisories. So many First Nations got moved. They have the Trail of Tears down in the United States, where they moved the people from Georgia and from the eastern United States, and they had to make that 800-kilometer, 800-mile walk, and many of them died. But there was relocation here to Ottawapiskat, where they keep talking about where they've had some problems. That was one of the relocations. The Inuit were relocated too. So that's not, and that's not, 200 years ago. That's
today.
Within the 40, 50 years ago, and still today,
Yeah.
Especially if there's flooding or for hydroelectric reasons, we're able to flood a reserve, but not an urban area, and then we'll give them some land after. There are still people displaced by flooding in Manitoba, from my understanding. So all these issues, there's such a myriad of issues. There's the governance issue, the voting on reserve issue, the development issue. There's also our our sacred obligations, our responsibilities, not understanding what that means for us in our future generations and how that links into the whole global cosmic picture. All of those things, like it's a series of things that have to be understood. And the most important thing is that we have to be, Canada and Canadians have to be willing to learn or to listen. If you don't want to learn, fine. And I think I gave you that example too, that Canada was like a person with a learner's license, and we were like having we were the older driver.
Yeah.
We knew how to drive the car, and they just wanted to get in and go.
Yeah.
And they're never going to get their drivers right now because they're still not learning how to properly drive in this country. And that's the other thing. Canada was, I think, that the committee at the United Nations on the elimination of racial discrimination sent out a caution to BC, or sent out some kind of a statement saying that really you should be considering, and you should not be going further with the Wet'suwet'en claim. Think about this, because CERD was the same department that asked Canada in 2007. They asked Canada at the international level, on what documents do you rely, Canada, to say Canada is yours? Do you have a bill of sale? They don't have anything.
Yeah.
So from 2007 on, we see Canada get into this rush to get Indians to the table, termination tables, where they cede and surrender their land so Canada can finally say, this is our land. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing that's happening. And you can see from where the Wet'suwet'en are standing, how they're standing there and holding on to their land. They're not willing to ever give up their land, because when we give up our land, we're giving up part of ourselves. We agreed to share. We did not agree to give away our land. We agreed to share. And we still, I think we still hold that idea, is that we're sharing the land. That's why, we're not, except for the colonizer assimilated Indians, we're not going over and saying, yes, you're not seeing protests that are standing with the pipeline people. You're seeing the Indigenous protesting, standing with the Wet'suwet'en, the true speakers, or the true voices of the land, because that's who we all are. Mm-hmm. So wherever we're from, downtown Vancouver or wherever, we're standing on the same understanding.
Thank you so much for
you're welcome.
letting us come out here and taking the time to share all this. I'm really looking forward to getting this up, because I think that there's a lot of people who would do well to listen to the perspectives that you shared here today. So thank you.
Okay,
for that.
good. Great.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Good? Oh, sorry. Making sure that we were good.
Hey, we're done?
Yeah, we're
Get
good.
out, I gotta
Awesome.
cook.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate this.